In this video, we will go over the single sign-on setup for GitHub Enterprise with enterprise managed users using Entra ID as an IDP. As a quick reminder, before we jump in, there are three main personas that will be involved in this process. A GitHub administrator who will be responsible for creating the GitHub tenant, the organizations and teams as well in the GitHub tenant, an Entra ID global admin who will be responsible for creating groups for your GitHub users and also approving anything that needs to be approved for the connection, as well as setting up that connection with your identity provider. And of course, the Entra ID subscription owner who will come into play in the next video once we go over Azure subscription connection. So let's jump in and take a look at the process from the vantage point of each of these three stakeholders. Once again, they can all be the same person, just with the different roles available to that person, or they can be a mix of people. We will make sure to note in the video who is who. So before even starting on configuring your GitHub tenant, it is important for an Entra ID admin to have created the appropriate groups in your Microsoft Entra ID so that they can be provisioned into GitHub. Ideally, you would have a list of users who would be either part of GitHub and or GitHub Copilot, and that list of users should be added to a group. We can create that group by navigating to Microsoft Entra ID and selecting groups. I'll create a new group. And in my case, I will create two groups, one for GitHub Copilot users and one for GitHub admins. With my two new groups created, one for GitHub admins and one for GitHub Copilot users, I can now move forward in creating the GitHub tenant. So creating a GitHub tenant starts with navigating to github.com. Once you have navigated to github.com, make sure you sign in with a personal account. We just want to make sure as a company that anyone creating tenants is a person. And so this sign on with your personal account is just a mandatory piece. Once I have signed on to GitHub with my account, I can navigate to my profile icon in the top right and select enterprises. This will give me a list of my existing enterprises, which in a lot of cases should be 0. And then I can create a new enterprise. On this new enterprise page, I will have the ability to spin up a 30-day free trial for a new enterprise tenant. And I will have the ability to choose one of two different enterprise types. Let's select enterprise with managed users, which is ideal for enterprise customers doing private and internal work and has configured single sign-on with your identity provider. I will then enter information to spin up this tenant, including where I would like to host my tenant and other pieces of information. Please note that in 99% of cases, hosting github.com without data residency will be preferable to you as a customer. However, if you do have strict regulatory requirements in terms of data hosting for your code, you may choose one of the available regions. It would be best to check with your GitHub or Microsoft sales team before making this decision. So I'll enter the information. Great. We have just sped through adding this information. Let's do a quick review of what we have entered. I've created an enterprise name. This is just a display name for my enterprise and can be changed. An enterprise URL slug. This is important and can be changed, although it is not suggested to. And as it says here, this enterprise account will be available at the following URL that you select. Finally, I've selected a shortcode which cannot be modified at any point, and this is a shortcode that is appended to all users of your enterprise. It is mostly aesthetic from a customer point of view, but it is limited to 3 to 8 characters. So make sure to choose an abbreviated version of your company that you can leverage. For example, a user will join this enterprise with Mona Lisa underscore Eldrick. If I had put GitHub, it would be Mona Lisa underscore GitHub if it wasn't already taken. Okay, so we will then go down and create the enterprise. And you will see that you will get a message saying your account was created successfully and using the password link at the email address you entered to continue. Again, remember that this should be a GitHub admin who goes through this process, and this GitHub admin will receive that email momentarily. So I have received the email as an admin for GitHub, and I have been set as the owner of the GitHub tenant. As an owner of a GitHub tenant, I will first receive a root admin user, which I will use just for the setup of SSO. We'll see a little bit what this looks like. I will click set my password, which will redirect me to my browser, and I will be able to choose a password of my choice. Once my password has been set, I will be able to log in to the account. Again, remember that your root admin will be your short code, which in my case is my first name underscore admin. If your company name was Contoso, it would be Contoso underscore admin. Awesome. So I now have my GitHub Enterprise tenant, which, if you recall, has this overview control plane and even has a guide to walk me through how to set up single sign-on with automated user provisioning. So the first step in setting up automated user provisioning will be for me to generate a SCIM token or SIEM. We'll click generate SCIM token, and the token will be directly created for us with all the permissions necessary, as you can see here. I won't change anything, and I will generate the token. I'll make sure to copy my token into a notepad of my choice and just have that saved for the rest of this process. Once I've copied it, I will then continue my setup. With that first step done, I will move to enable single sign-on as a second step. When enabling single sign-on, I have the option between OpenID Connect and SAML. These are two single sign-on technologies. They work very similarly. However, OpenID Connect is preferred for Microsoft Entra ID customers due to some of the additional security capabilities included. Contact your Microsoft sales team if you have additional questions. So on this page, I will select Enable OIDC configuration. And here I will want to set up OpenID Connect with the correct account for my Entra ID. I'm going to, in my case, use the admin role because I happen to have it. But if you are not an admin, you would be able to submit a request for your admin, your Entra ID admin, to approve the creation of this application. In my case, I will just skip that step. And you will see that the application will request certain permissions through which I can click accept. Awesome. So the OIDC enterprise application is created on the Entra ID side. We will check it in a second. But before, as the GitHub admin, I should save these recovery codes in a safe place. I will do this by downloading and saving them. Make sure that these are saved once again, because if you need to ever come back through this process or have access to this root account, you will need the recovery codes to do so moving forward. I will then enable the authentication, and we have SSO enabled. The final step for configuring provisioning involves configuring the skim piece. Now, before provisioning your users, let's navigate to users and groups. And this is where we will assign the groups that were created earlier by our Entra ID tenant to the application. We'll assign both the GitHub admins and GitHub Copilot users, each with their own specific role. So our admins will have enterprise owner, which is the administrative role in GitHub. And our GitHub Copilot users will have the user role, which is the default role in GitHub. We will refresh. And with these roles and groups now correctly assigned, let's turn on provisioning. We will navigate to the provisioning page and select new configuration. And we will have to enter a tenant URL and a secret token. The tenant URL will be found alongside the documentation that was sent for you to watch this video. Make sure to edit this tenant URL so that it matches your slug for your GitHub tenant. If you forget what your slug looks like, make sure to navigate back to your GitHub tenant and you will see it here. The token is the token that was created by the GitHub admin. We will then test connection. And once that connection is successful, we will create the provisioning. Once the provisioning created, we will start it. And wait for the users to be pushed directly to users and groups to be pushed directly to GitHub. Our provisioning has successfully started. Note that the provisioning interval is a fixed 40 minutes, which means that you will have to wait on average about 40 minutes every time you add a user to this enterprise application for them to be reflected in GitHub. If you don't want to wait, you can select the provision on demand option and push your users immediately. Great. With my users now provisioned, let me turn on my GitHub Enterprise hat, navigate back to GitHub, and as the admin, we can come to our GitHub overview page and refresh it. We can see that provisioning has been successful because we have at least one enterprise owner. And then as a GitHub admin, I can switch to not using the root account anymore, but using my actual new administrative account. I'll be asked to SSO. And I now have single sign-on complete for my enterprise. I can navigate to people to check who has been provisioned. And you can see that we have a couple of users, including myself and my test user, who are provisioned in. So now that we have configured GitHub Enterprise with single sign-on, feel free to watch the next video on configuring an Azure subscription, creating an organization, and eventually assigning Copilot licenses.